Okay, welcome to week 4. How are we doing, class? Hope everyone is safe and healthy as usual. I feel totally fine now, so I don't know what I had. It might have been COVID 19 and I just had very mild symptoms, or could have just been a cold. No way to tell. But I'm feeling fine, so if anybody was up late worrying about me, you can stop doing that now. I don't think there were any people doing that, but just in case. So, week 4, I'm on the first day, which would be Monday, and we're going to be doing patterns of subsistence. This is economic anthropology, and it's really just sort of the basics that we're still getting out of the way. After midterms, we'll start getting into some more complicated things. Please note that in week 5 we do have our exam 1, but I also am going to upload an exam review, and I will explain more about that in the next the next video, okay? So yeah, chapter 17. Oh, my computer's going to be slow. Okay, patterns of subsistence. We are going to be talking about the various ways in which societies organize themselves economically. And this is one of the ways that people may meet their basic needs. We were talking about basic needs early on in the class. So the book that you're using, I believe, breaks up all different patterns of subsistence into 5 categories. Most books do 4 or 5. I'm actually going to do 6, and I'm going to do foraging, pastoral, horticultural, agricultural, industrial, and post industrial. And I'm not going to focus a lot on post industrial, but I think it's worth mentioning in order to get you thinking about this stuff because it's going to be important in your lives, but not necessarily in this class, okay? So why anthropologists study modes of subsistence. Sorry, before I go on, modes of subsistence and mode of production are pretty much synonyms. We're going to be using those interchangeably. Your book uses the term mode of subsistence, I believe, but if I accidentally say mode of production every once in a while, that's a term that Karl Marx uses. That's a perfectly good substitution, and they're really very similar. So the reason anthropologists study economics, because like gender or language, it's one of those basic building blocks of a culture that you can learn a ton about another place just by knowing what their mode of subsistence is. So there are patterns. There are patterns of gender hierarchy, of social structure, of technological advancement that are associated with each of these 6 different modes of subsistence. And so, if you were to tell me, oh, I'm an anthropologist and I just jumped out of an airplane and helicoptered into, parachuted into this culture, and they are an intensive agricultural society, I could tell you some broad outlines about that culture that would likely be true. Now, also realize that this is on a spectrum, so there's not very many cultures or societies that are 100% foraging, and there's not very many societies that are 100% industrial. Most societies are a sort of somewhere on this scale, okay? It's a sliding scale. So again, we're going to be talking about foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, intensive agriculture, post industrialism, and then post industrialism. And these are pretty much historically accurate in terms of they're linear in terms of when people first started participating in these modes of production. So humans spent the vast majority of our evolutionary history as foragers. Okay, sometimes foragers are called hunter and gatherers, but I'm going to push back on that, and I don't really like the term hunter and gatherer for a lot of reasons. So nowadays, most anthropologists use the term foragers. So we've spent millions and millions of years as foragers, and before we were even humans, when we were proto-humans, which we'll learn about a lot if you take the biological anthropology courses, or even apes, there are most of them are foragers. So uh, foraging is really built into our DNA, and a lot of the interesting social problems we have, especially with like our diet today in our industrial, post-industrial society that we live today, a lot of those problems are because so much of our culture and our biology is adapted to a foraging lifestyle. So, foraging, as a definition, also known as hunting and gathering, but I'm going to try to steer away from that, is the production of food by collecting wild, undomesticated animals and plants. Okay? Not domesticated animals and plants, wild plants. Humans spend the vast majority of our existence as foragers. So, foraging, I'm using that term instead of hunter gatherer, is preferred today because hunting and gathering gives equal weight to meat from hunting and plants that are gathered. So, in most foraging communities, not all, but usually the men will be the hunters and women will do the foraging. Not always, though. I almost said hunting and gathering. Some foraging societies, women do hunting, and in actually most foraging societies, men also work in gathering. But um, it tends to be in foraging societies that a very small portion of their caloric intake, the actual calories they get from food, is from hunting. Hunting is very difficult. You're not very guaranteed to bring back meat, and so only like 10% or less of their actual total amount of calories comes from hunting. Most of the food comes from gathering. And so if you call them hunters gatherers, then you're putting this big emphasis on the work of men and what men are doing hunting, when actually it's sort of outsized. Women are doing the vast majority of food collection. Most of the time, but not always, okay? These are broad generalizations. So, also another characterization of foraging that is incorrect that you might have heard, Thomas Hobbes called foragers or hunters and gatherers as nasty. He described their lives, as nasty, brutish, and short. So you might think of foragers as constantly on the edge of dying, just a very harsh existence. You catch a cold or you break your leg, and then you just die because there's no medicine and no one to help you. But a lot of those characterizations as the caveman lifestyle is just not true. So you might have heard before that foragers or hunter and gatherers have these very, very low mortality life expectancies, something like 33 years or 40 years life expectancy, and that's true. That's the average age that they might live, but that's not doesn't mean that there weren't older people. The reason that number is so low is because they had very, very high infant mortality rates. So a lot of our technological advancement recently has been being able to keep more and more infants alive. We have much higher infant mortality rates. So when a baby dies after being just a few days old, then that brings that total average of life expectancy way down. But even for hunter gatherers and for foragers, if they were able to survive infancy and they made it to puberty, more than likely they would make it into their 60s or even 70s. So they didn't have these really, really short life expectancies that you might glean from just looking at the average age of death. And also, they didn't very work that hard because this is a time when there's not very high population density. Most foragers had a lot of territory and they walked around and roamed very large territories without bumping into other groups of humans very often. And so they didn't have to work very hard. You think about it, you just literally walk into the forest and collect the food that you're going to eat. And they had very simple houses, and a lot of the times they didn't even have permanent houses. They would just move around from day to day and camp and sleep wherever they ended up at the end of the evening. And so they only worked 20 to 30 hours a week. And so it wasn't this really harsh lifestyle that some people might think. Don't worry about the work to play dichotomy, we'll just skip that. So some of the characterizations that you might glean from if you just told me that some group of people were foragers is I would probably guess that their gender relationships, the relationship between men and women, is relatively egalitarian. Like I said, in most foraging societies, hunting is like not that big of a deal. People do go on these hunting expeditions, and when they get meat, the meat is very prized because they don't eat a lot of meat. But most people gather food, and they don't really have strict gender distinctions in terms of what kind of men and women doing different kinds of labor or work. So they're relatively egalitarian. Their political system is very decentralized and shared and highly mobile. So there may be somebody who's kind of sort of in charge of the group, but that doesn't mean that they have absolute power, and they're not really elected. A lot of people don't really want to be the responsible person in the group, and there's not a big broad political system or anything like that. And the group structure is they're small bands, so people of less than 100 people, where you know all of the people. You're intimately familiar with all of the different people that you're moving around with. And these groups would also shift a lot. Sometimes groups of 10 or 20 would come together briefly, and then they would split off again, maybe mixing up differently. So it was very fluid. Now, you don't have to know every single piece of all this information, but it's good to have a broad outline, a general understanding. Excuse me, let me take a drink. So, horticultural societies have been around for quite a while, but not nearly as long as foragers. Um, so, in the relatively recent past, several thousands of years, people started to do this sort of low technology farming. So, horticulture is a production system based on low technology farming or gardening without the use of plows, draft animals, irrigation, or fertilizer. So, this is generally characterized by slash and burn, or what we sometimes call swidden agriculture. What they would do is they would have a relatively stable uh, place that they would reside. So they would have houses and things like that built, but they would be semi-permanent houses. They weren't meant to stay there forever. And they would have fields around the houses where they would burn down the forest or whatever vegetation was there, and that would make the ground very nitrogen rich and ready to plant some very basic food stuff, probably potatoes, stuff that grows. You just put it on the ground, or you dig a little bit and you just put it and plant it, and then you don't do anything. You're not out there constantly weeding, constantly spraying. There's not a lot to do. You just burn the forest, plant the seed, let it grow, and then you can eat it. But they're usually horticulturists are usually also mixing this with gathering, with foraging. So they will have their sort of gardens and things like that built up around their houses, but they will also be going into the forest and collecting wild food stuff from animals and plants. So they might be fishermen or something like that. You saw this in the film we watched with Malinowski and the Trobriand Islands, how they were gardeners, but they would also go on these fishing expeditions. Fishing is a kind of gathering because they were not domesticated fish. Okay. So if you told me that a culture was a horticultural society, I would guess that their gender relations vary quite a bit because it depends on the environment in which they're in, and sometimes men have very strict roles. Sometimes in these groups, men are warriors, and so men have a little bit different labor and are doing different kinds of things than women are, and so you can have a fairly a varied gender relationship between men and women, but there are also horticultural societies that are relatively egalitarian, and men and women are relatively equal. So, as a group of people, the people are starting to organize. It takes a certain amount of organization for people to build semi-permanent houses, and for them to decide as a group which part of the forest they are going to burn, and when they're going to pick up their entire town after they've burnt a certain area for several times and planted several times. That's no longer going to yield the same amount of food, and so they'll just pick up their entire village and move several kilometers away and start again. And it's very sustainable. You can do this over and over and over, as long as you don't have very high population density of different groups of people doing it. So you do need some sort of political system, some sort of body of people that are making decisions and know how to do these kinds of things. But you're not getting kings and queens or anything like that. There might be elected officials, or there might be a group of elders or village chiefs that are seen as the people that make the decisions, big men. So the group structure tends to be larger because you can support a larger population with this kind of low technology agriculture. You can support a larger population by having a relatively stable supply of food coming from the garden and also from foraging. And again, these are semi-permanent villages that are shifting their fields back and forth. So that's horticulturist, low technology farming combined with foraging. The next group, the next mode of subsistence we're going to be talking about is pastoralists, or animal herders, they're sometimes called. These are also relatively recent because it wasn't all that long ago that we started domesticating animals. In terms of humans' long history, in terms of the recent past, okay? So they would have cropped up around the same time as horticulturists, starting to domesticate cattle, starting to domesticate reindeer, these sorts of animals, goats, sheep. So it's a pastoralist is a productive system based on domesticated animals as the main source of food. They might also do some foraging. They might also do a little bit of gardening, like a horticulturist, right? But their main source of food is animals in the form of meat, milk, blood, yogurt, and butter. So, yeah, these are domesticated animals too. This isn't a group of people that are hunting constantly and eating wild animals as their main source of food. That almost never works. It never really creates enough food for people. They always need a mix of that. But when you start domesticating animals, you can use them as your main source of food. So, in these groups of people, the gender relations tend to be very male dominated. They're working with these big, gigantic animals, and it's sort of the men's job to control the animals. And because men have control over the main source of food for the entire group, they also control, you know, all the milk, meat, butter, blood, yogurt, and the product of production, what they're making. They control the food, and so they tend to be mostly male dominated. But there is some variation. Their political systems are semi-centralized. You do need a certain amount of political system of politics in order to decide which groups of people can take their take their animals out to what pastures. You want to make sure that you're not overgrazing or any particular area. You want to kind of control that. You don't want to totally destroy a landscape and have the plants not come back because you've overgrazed. So you need a certain amount of political system just to control that. But it does vary a lot. Sometimes the animals are owned by the group, and sometimes there's private ownership where a certain individual might have a very large herd of animals, and other other individuals or families might have a very small herd of animals. So there's sort of this economic inequality that you start seeing in these groups of people that you haven't really seen before. And so the group structure varies. Sometimes they're very nomadic, and they're just constantly moving around across a very large range of area, and sometimes they're only semi-nomadic. So they might have a sort of semi-permanent village, and then they take their animals and they take their animals out for long periods of time to be to different pastures, and then come back to the village from time to time. Uh, Pastoralists will also sometimes use slash and burn agriculture, and they will also sometimes use gardening. So if they have a semi-permanent village, they might have some small gardens around there in case there's a plague that knocks out, or a disease that knocks out a big portion of their animals. It's sort of a fallback plan, sort of a social safety net for them. But they tend not to use it as their main source of food in good weather and good times. Don't worry about domestication. I think we're okay understanding what the process of domestication is. So now we're getting to intensive agriculture, or sometimes called high input and high yield farming. So intensive agriculture is high input, high yield farming on permanent farmlands through the use of technologies like irrigation, fertilizer, pesticide, and the plow. So when you have these higher levels of technology, intensive agriculture didn't start just a few thousand years ago. We started using intensive agriculture. It's relatively new, and you can support a very large population on intensive agriculture because you're using a small amount of land to produce a lot of food, but it takes a lot of labor, and it takes a lot of technologies. You have to know irrigation, and if you're just plowing the same field and planting on the same field, you have to understand crop rotation because you're going to diminish the nitrogen and other nutrients in the soil. You have to understand fertilizer, you have to understand pesticides, natural or otherwise, to be able to do this. Now, gender relations start shifting pretty dramatically in intensive agriculture societies. All around the world, as soon as you find an intensive agricultural society, you find very different gender relation. You find very male-dominated gender relationships. Men are the ones working the fields and typically doing all this heavy labor. It tends to be very, very manual labor intensive, controlling the big animals again, and that's seen as a man's job. Men, their strength is you know, slightly larger strength. I've told you that there's not that much sexual dimorphism in humans, but there is some, and so they took over a lot of the very heavy, hard to do jobs in these sort of farming communities. So the political systems tend to be centralized. You start seeing stratified society. Some people in the group, there's not a lot of collective farming a lot of the time. Some people in the group have very large fields, other people have very small fields. Some people are politically connected because if you have this very big group of people living together in a city that doesn't move, that never moves, then you start having there's a good side of town and a bad side of town. You need to have a big government in order to control where you throw out your garbage, where you defecate, where you do a lot of things. You need a certain amount of centralized government in order to organize society. So you start seeing that. The group structure is pretty large. You're starting to get populations of several hundred or thousand, so you may not know everybody in the group that you're living with for the first time. This is a big group of people. And they're sedentary. They're not moving around. They were born in one town and probably live there their entire life and never move. But interestingly, intensive agriculture, with all of their technology, they had much poorer health than foragers and horticulturalists. We might think of, oh, this is progress. We're advancing and moving up the chain of technology, and this is good. That must be advantageous. But actually, it wasn't. The places where you start seeing intensive agriculture, people are adopting intensive agriculture not as a new technology that's going to help them, but because they have to. As I said earlier, foragers only spend 20 or 30 hours a week feeding, clothing, and doing all these basic things that humans need. But intensive agriculturalists will do this 60 hours. It takes a lot of work to do this, and the reason they adopt this is because of population pressure. You're starting to get areas of the world where humans have spread out and are increasing in population so rapidly that in order to maintain those very high populations, you need this technology. Okay? So it's adapted sort of haphazardly, and we know that intensive agriculturalists had poorer health than horticulturalists and foragers and pastoralists just by their skeletons. You can see that they had very bad teeth. They're eating a lot of grains and these sort of domesticated plants that are not as healthy for us. They have lots and lots of cavities. Usually they rely on just one or two plants that they're eating. Like they might have an entire agricultural system based on potatoes, for example, and that doesn't give them a variety of nutrients like we would expect from a forager who might be eating tons and tons of different kinds of plants and animals constantly and getting a wide variety of nutrients, sort of like if we just ate potatoes all day every day. And so so intensive agriculturalists would come. You look at their skeletons, and some of them are only 4 feet tall, 4.5 feet tall, while foragers are almost as tall as modern humans. You and I today. They're very healthy, strong. But they intensive agriculturalists also had lower life expectancies. Disease could come out and wipe out the entire potato crop, for example, and then that would be their main source of food, and there'd be starvation. So this wasn't necessarily a great thing for humanity. It was something that they did reluctantly. This is also when you see the origins of the state. You start seeing cities being built with walls. Now that you have governments, you can actually support an aristocracy, a group of people that don't, you know, necessarily work the land. In intensive agriculture, about 90% of the population will be involved in food production as their main mode of subsistence. So most of them are working in food production, working on the farms, but there's a certain group of people that are artisans and they are government officials and they are blacksmiths and these other kinds of things, which is how you start seeing technologies advance. It freed a certain subset of the population to work on other things. And you also start seeing the development of armies. So then you start seeing, military and expeditions and certain towns going over to take over other towns, and it's the beginning of what we call civilization. Like, I don't really like that term because I think foragers were perfectly civilized people. We don't like to call them brutes or barbarians or those words that we've heard anthropologists use before. But it's the basic, a form of, it's the beginning of civilization, a form of society based on cities as the center of administration and the focus of social life, usually dependent on intensive agriculture in the surrounding countryside. We don't have to worry about peasants. So, industrialism. Industrialism is the newest form that we've been talking about. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink. And it's an economic system and social system based on the production of large quantities of inexpensive manufactured goods and the concentration of employment in urban factories. So this is very new and very radical. It started in the late 1800s and continued up until 1950s, 1960s, and then we started to see deindustrialization in some places like the United States, which we'll talk about. But the main difference between industrialization and intensive agriculture is that industrialism, the vast majority of the population is no longer working in food production. So you have a technological advance where you're using tractors and you're using all these pesticides and your technology of food production has advanced so much that a very, very small percentage of the population is actually involved in food production. Like today, does anybody know a farmer? Usually I ask the class and nobody raises their hand. Maybe one person knows somebody who had a garden, which doesn't really count. We all still, some people still garden. But now less than like 1/10 of 1% of the entire population of the United States makes all of the food for the rest of society. And they can actually make food so efficiently that we export food. And the United States is a net exporter of food. So, with that food problem solved, everybody's working in factories, and they're, for the very first time, working for wages. And so you get these very different gender relations. Now, in industrial societies, the gender relations do vary quite a bit, but it's much, much more egalitarian in general than agricultural societies because men and women can start doing a lot of the same kinds of jobs. A woman can build a car or make a whatever it is at the factory just as well as a man, and you start seeing this slow, gradual shift to women working coming out in the United States and working in factories and working in paid labor. And at this point, you also get the political system of the nation state. So you started seeing these walled cities from agricultural societies that were joining forces and becoming these kind of collectivized, city states. Well, now you're starting to see nation states, these very big, highly organized, very large population, urban population nation states like the United States today. So large urban populations, very few people involved in food production, and also a division of labor. While lots of people are working in factories, there's also people that are lawyers. There's blue collar work, there's white collar work, there's and everything in between. So this is something that we're all pretty familiar with. But again, it's very new. A lot of problems with human again health is the direct, we're not really meant to be working in factories and just sitting and standing for 9-10 hours a day, these kinds of things. We're not very well adapted to it. So, ever since the 1960s, the 1970s, we've sort of been going into this post industrial economy. And I'm not going to spend a very long time on this because this is relatively new. Not all anthropologists necessarily agree that we're now in a post industrial economy. But I'd like to talk about it. It's food for thought. So, a post industrial economy refers to a period of growth within an industrialized economy or nation in which the relative importance of manufacturing reduces, and that of services, information, and research grows. So, most of us are probably not going to get manufacturing jobs. Most of us are not going to go to college, or, well, most of us don't go to college, but that's all right. Most of us are not going to get a job actually making something where you go into work, you make something at the end of the day, there's a tangible object that you've created. We work in services. The most of the job growth in the United States has been in services. So, giving like this is a think about the gig economy. Those are services. That's the fastest growing sector. Or healthcare. That's also a service. They're not producing a product. They're just providing a service. Right now, we're at a university. I'm providing a service to you. I'm teaching you something. I don't produce anything. I just sort of provide a service to you and then give you one a day. You'll all receive diplomas, and poof, you're an educated person, right? And then there's also a big growth in information technology. So another big growth sector of the United States economy right now is things like Google, Amazon. They don't produce anything. They're just have information. Okay, metadata. So there's also, along with that, you see the informal economy growing, and the marginal, unofficial, even illicit zone of the economy is consisting mainly of workers that is impermanent, irregular, and not guaranteed a fixed wage, right? So people no longer have the same job like they did in industrialism. You heard about General Motors and Ford, and they would during industrialism, they would work at the factory for their entire lives and have a guaranteed pay, guaranteed retirement, all these great benefits. And gig economy workers do not have that. They're expected to be working multiple gigs and hopefully making a surplus of money that they're required to be investing and saving for retirement. But they don't have a lot of these guarantees as before. So, I don't have a discussion. This is not a discussion question that I'm going to make you all write or anything like that. But just think about this a little bit. This is normally something I would have everybody get together and discuss. What mode of production, what mode of subsistence would you like to live in, and why? How does your gender influence the way that you might choose one? Choose one of these. So this is where I'd have everybody say, okay, who, based on this information, who would want to live in a foraging society? Who would want to live in a post-industrial society? And etc. So just give that a thought, please. All right, thank you. Next class, we're going to be talking, I believe, about Chapter 18, and we will be talking about um, modes of production. Oh, I'm sorry, we just talked about modes of production. I meant economics. We will be talking about distribution and consumption.